Hey, Erev Tov, everybody. I'm still wearing
Hey,
my
hey, Vassal.
American flag
Oh, good.
tie, and earlier today I was also wearing my Jerusalem hat as
Um,
we celebrated both marked
I,
Memorial Day and celebrated Yom Yerushalayim. We were privileged to hear a great lecture from Ira Epstein on the history and meaning of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav just a bit ago.
uh-huh.
Um, Now we're entering into the book of Bamidbar with a new study partner, Rabbi
Oh,
Josh Fagelson. He was my uh, big brother mentor at Chovevei. He was a senior when I was a freshman, if we can use those terms for rabbinical school. He was a fourth year when I was a first year. And we also knew each other from the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, and I was always very admiring of his. In fact, from the time I knew him, he was always someone who did what his um, books and ideas talk about, which is ask big questions. Um, and uh, and and while at Chovevei he was not the kind of um, leader of the sort of meditation and spirituality uh, chevra in Chovevei. He certainly was a part of it. And in fact, in the essay today, he quotes his colleague, Sam Feinsmith, Rabbi Sam Feinsmith, who was, excuse me, the person who really was the, lead figure in my time in Chovevei in meditation and spirituality, and so they're connected for me, and this is an opportunity to really learn from a colleague and kind of bring our um, exposure into the circle of Chovevei alumni, which is a special privilege and opportunity. Um, and that's what we're going to be doing for the Book of Bamidbar, especially since we're starting at 9 o'clock. These are slightly shorter, a little less textually dense, and I think on the spectrum of kind of conversational styles, it's not as extreme as Rabbi Foreman in terms of a kind of that rhetorical style and bringing the reader along for the ride. But there is a conversational dimension to it and a personal dimension to it, um, and a very heartfelt sense in his writing. And the if you had a chance to look at the introduction, which we're not going to go through tonight and probably not on any night, but you have it in the first email, and maybe we'll include it again in the next one.
I didn't
Um,
get the email.
he talks about his, focus on Hasidic thinkers as people who, in a sense, ask the big questions and help us, zero in on a core element. Um, or theme in the Parsha and put them in conversation, as he writes in the introduction, with a wide range of other writers, poets, musicians, and thinkers. In that sense, he has a lot in common with Dr. Aviva Zornberg, although she includes more classical commentaries and midrash, but she certainly includes Hasidic thinkers and poets, musicians, philosophers, etc. Um, and we'll have a chance to read one text more at length and then see how he unpacks it and explains it. Say his writing style may be most similar to Rabbi Shai Held from those that we've learned, and it ends with kind of questions for reflection and opportunities for spiritual practice. We'll see how we do time wise each week. My goal is not to go past about 9:40. And hopefully we'll have time to read through and also to discuss. So I think this we'll find you'll find this one different than maybe any of the others that we've seen so far in terms of really zeroing in on a spiritual and also practically applicable theme and attempting to really make it speak to our daily lives. So, in to the extent to which there's a uh, differentiation between the two terms of eisegesis and exegesis, uh, one being kind of interpreting the text inside the text and the other being sort of extracting something from the text. This is much more in the sense of kind of to draw something out from the text to then stand on its own. And without further ado, Bamidbar, do you count? He writes, ever since I encountered it years ago, I periodically find myself thinking of Bertolt Brecht's poem, A Bed for the Night. The poem is about a man who goes out every night on the corner of 26th and Broadway to ask passers-by to give lodging to homeless people. It's a good thing, Brecht says. We can help individuals to be warm for a night. We can ensure they are protected from the elements. But, he reminds us, our one little act won't really change the world. It won't change the larger systems that bring about homelessness or hunger. We can do some good, but we can't change everything with our individual righteous action. My mind goes to this poem when I think about individual cases of suffering that I witness or confront. A person begging for money or food, or in need of health care they can't afford, or unable to access the many bureaucratic systems of modern society, from banking to the internet to education to voter registration. My own compassion and sense of responsibility moves me to try to help them, and yet my thinking mind knows that this will not solve the larger systemic problems they confront. A few people have a bed for the night, but it won't change the world. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. The poem, like my experience, lives in a toggle between the specific, infinitely valuable image of God in front of me, a person who has a name and a story, and the larger, faceless category of homeless, or hungry, or society's most vulnerable. I can do something about the first, give them something tangible, call them by their name, notice them. But for the latter, which is abstract, which lacks a specific name, but rather exists as numbers and charts and statistics, not so much. Even as I try to bring attention to this person, this manifestation of the divine presence, I think of the larger systems and the many others who also have faces and names, but who, in the abstract, are simply the poor and suffering. It is this tension between the specific named human with a face and the general quantified category without one that animates much of the Book of Numbers. The book derives its name from the multiple censuses that take place in it. Here he's referring to numbers as opposed to the book Numbers, which is what the sages actually call it. Chumash HaPikudim, the one of the 5 books that's about accountings or censuses, derives its name from the multiple censuses that take place in it. The first happens in our Parashah this week, while another occurs 40 years later in Parashat Pinchas. In both cases, the counting seems intended to prepare the Israelites for their corporate life, the military, as a nation, in the land of Canaan, a transition that requires a significant degree of self-effacement and assimilation into a whole. Furthermore, and in a sense, we could say that, what the transition that happens from Bereshit to Shmot happens going from being a family to being a nation. And then this transition that's happening in a way somehow from Shmot to Bamidbar is sort of the story of a nation that's not focused on organization, structure, and order into a nation which is somehow more structured and ordered. Furthermore, the counting and the larger questions of incorporation into a collective identity it both enacts and represents also marks another kind of transition from a founding generation that directly experienced the exodus from Egypt to a new generation that will now have to negotiate the complexities of memory and tradition as they confront the realities of their own time and place. In the book of Numbers, for the first time, a generation of Jews begins to ask, how do we remember the Exodus? How do we remain in a genuine relationship with the divine and the Torah that was revealed to our ancestors, even as we encounter the circumstances of our own time and place which are both similar and different from theirs. Right? So the transition from Shmot to Bamidbar is not just a transition from kind of a nation in formation to a organized, structured nation, but also from a nation that is experiencing its formation firsthand to a nation which is already in its second generation charged with remembering and preserving the events of the first. How do we carry the abstract concept of Jewish tradition with us and live ourselves into it and it into us? The abstraction from individual names and faces to the numbers of a corporate entity. This is the transition of the Book of Numbers. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Rabinowitz, 19th century, offers a reflection on this theme in the Pri Tzaddik. He's called generally Rav Tzadok HaKohen, wrote a number of works, and this is one of his most well-known, Pri Tzaddik. He elaborates on the counting that takes place in Parshat Bamidbar, as well as the repetitive nature of the princely offerings in Parashat Naso, and invites us to approach them with fresh eyes. You can feel free to read the Hebrew on your own. We're going to go to the English translation, which is a fairly literal but somewhat colloquial translation. After the Torah recounts the tally of each tribe, this is in our Parashah, you can see Numbers chapter 1, verses 44 to 45. So after the Torah recounts the tally of each tribe, it then summarizes. These are those that were counted, and the total number was, right, it was 603,550. The Talmud asks, why does the Torah need to report the accounting? Why does the Torah need to write the total number? Everyone could simply add up the count of each tribe altogether, right? If you read through chapter 1, you get the number, because the census was done by tribe. For each tribe, you get their number. So at the end, when the Torah says, and the total was 603,550, it's true, but you could have figured that out by tallying up the numbers that were in all of the previous summary verses. Furthermore, the text repeats the tally as it recounts the host arrayed around each tribal flag in chapter 2. And like the earlier section, here too, the Torah adds up the total of each tribe by its flag. Given that the Torah contains no extraneous letters, much less entire sections, we are left to wonder, what is the meaning here? Okay, so the question of Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen is, the Torah seems to be superfluous in adding various summaries, total calculations of totals, where all the original contributing data was already included. Truth be told, we have a similar question in the case of the offerings of each of the tribal leaders in chapter 7. Now, this is a question from Parshat Naso, which we'll encounter a week later, in which the offering of each leader is recounted in detail, even though all of them made exactly the same offering. And also in chapter 7, we have the offerings that were brought by the Nesiim, by the princes or the tribal leaders, to mark the occasion of the inauguration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. And we get, the detailing of each of their gifts, and each gift was exactly the same, all the same number of animals and the same, finely ground flour and the same golden vessels. And the Torah says, it introduces each one on such and such day was the prince of the tribe of whichever tribe. We get the prince name, and then we say, and here was his offering, and it goes through the same 4 or 5 psukim. Why does it repeat it for each one? To economize, the Torah could simply have said, thus brought the leader of tribe X, right? He puts it in Hebrew and says, V'hava leilomar, v'chein hikriv, nasi shevet ploni. Right, after the first day, could have said, and so similarly offered the prince of such and such tribe on the next day, and so similarly offered the prince of such and such tribe on the next day. Moreover, after the completion of all of the leaders' offerings, the Torah likewise offers a summation, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach, Numbers chapter 7, verses 44 to 49, which simply is nothing more than the exact same paragraph that's been repeated 12 times, only the numbers of each thing are multiplied by 12. So, where if each of them brought two of something, at the end it says there were 24 of those things was the total, which includes a total of all the offerings. Okay, so what's with all the repetition where you could have just said ditto, and what's with the summary total paragraphs, like the bottom line of the spreadsheet, when you could just have added up the lines of all the above ones, in your mind and known the total. It would appear that this bothered the authors of Midrash Rabbah, and he's now reflecting on some Midrashim in Bamidbar Rabbah, commenting on our passages, who interpreted different meanings related to each tribe's offering. Here, the answer seems to be coming from a Midrash on the second question, not the question from our Parsha about the census, but the question from Parshat Naso about the tribal offerings. He's going to answer from there and then relate it back to our case. That is, even though the offering itself was the same from tribe to tribe, nevertheless, each tribal leader brought his offering with a unique intention. Then further, in the summative paragraph, the Midrash likewise interpreted different meanings. That is, when the total numbers of the offerings were added up, a new intention could be discerned, right? So if each of the princely leaders brought two of something, and therefore the total was 24, there was a meaning to the 24. It had its own significance over and above the fact that it was simply 12 times 2. So too in our case of the two counts of the people, right? So Rabbi Tzadok is saying the Midrash was curious about this notion of repetition and summation in the case of the princely gifts for the inauguration, and its answer was there was a distinct intention or meaning to each of the individuals, so they all had to be mentioned, and then there is something unique to be interpreted from the summation, and so it separately had to be mentioned. And so too, says Rabbi Tzadok, we can apply this to our censuses. Ramban Nachmanides asks, why did the Torah need to make this count? Now he's coming back to the question of the censuses and taking another approach. Ramban answers, that perhaps the Torah wished to remind the Israelites of God's great love for them, that they went down to Egypt with 70 souls, and now here they are, as numerous as the sands of the sea. Yet we still find a difficulty with this interpretation, as there were many more Israelites who did not come out of Egypt. And he's going to make this point. We need another sentence to understand it. According to various interpretations, only one of 5, or possibly one of 50, or even one of 500 actually came out. There were many more than in Egypt, yet they were not counted. In other words, if the Ramban's explanation for why there is a census is to show the Jewish people how much they've grown. God promised that they would be numerous. They started out as 70 when they went down to Egypt, and look how many they've become now as they're now going, embarking on their journey through the wilderness. But wait a minute, they were even more when they were back in Egypt before the Exodus, because the Midrashic tradition tells us only 1 in 5 or 1 in 50 or 1 in 500 actually came out. So they were at least 3 million or maybe 30 million when they were still in Egypt, but they didn't get a census then. So if the purpose of the census is to show us how numerous we've become, we would have expected, according to the Pri Tzaddik on his Rabbi Tzadok commenting on the Ramban's commentary, if that were the purpose of the census, we would have expected a census in Egypt, but there wasn't. So we can't assume that that's the reason for the census. Rather, we could, of course, give a different answer that we only need to do a census when they've come out of Egypt and they are a nation. But okay, we'll put that on the side. For the Ramban's point, we can offer that rejoinder. Rather, the essential intent of this counting was to raise up their heads in the spirit of the Mishnah that states, every person has their time and everything has its place. That is, now we're really getting into Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen's take. Every Jew has a moment wherein they are greater than all their fellows, and likewise for their friend at another moment. This is because each member of Israel has a share in the Torah, a letter or a section of a letter, and without that letter or section, the Torah scroll, that is the totality of Israel, is not fit for ritual use. The language he uses is HaSefer Torah Pasul, meaning halachically, it's unfit to read if it's missing a letter or an integral part of a letter. And if the Jewish people are like that Torah, then we are somehow not fit, not right when we're missing, one of us, or one of us is not somehow fulfilling our purpose. Um, this is related to the notion of the troops of the Torah, chaylin deoraita, is his term, that Moshe counted, and this is somehow a sort of special name for the Jewish people, that Moshe counted in order to know within each tribe the unique holiness and teaching of each and every person. Okay, so now he's coming to say the purpose of the census is actually to somehow elicit an understanding, or highlight the special and unique feature, characteristic, gift that every single individual from the Jewish people is going to contribute. This is why the language is repeated, in order to hint at these differing meanings within each tribe. For the 12 tribes correspond to the 12 months, the 12 signs of the zodiac, and the 12 permutations of Yud He Vav He. Similarly, we see that when Yaakov blessed each of the tribal ancestors, meaning Yaakov's sons who were the progenitors of the tribes, individually, he then blessed them as one. As the Torah says, all these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number, and this is what their father said to them as he bade them farewell, addressing to each a parting word appropriate to him. And the understanding here seems to be that after the individual blessings, there was some collective blessing that Yaakov gave. So there too, we have the individual tribes and then their collectivity. And so too here, we need to have the individual tribal totals and then the total of the collectivity, because each tribe has its own meaning, and then there's a meaning to the collective. In our case, Moses counted the people tribe by tribe as members of the host of the Torah, and Aaron counted them as members of the host of the Mishkan. Reb Tzadok's question is straightforward enough. Why all the repetition? And why in particular all the repetition of numbers? And his answer likewise is simple and elegant, an elaboration of the phrase the Torah itself uses to describe the counting at the very beginning of the book of Bamidbar. B'mispar shemot, literally the number of their names, right? Not just b'misparam, according to their numbers, but the number of their names. Each counting is an invitation to recognize some different facet of the uniqueness of each member of the host, if we can embrace it as such. And that if is what he's going to come to now, right? So what we've understood so far is that from Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, we see that the census, the purpose of the census is somehow to distill the unique quality of every individual, what's going to be their grand moment, their special gift, their unique characteristics, and we need kind of their individual units and then their collective to sort of highlight this distinction. It's a little bit fuzzy when he's sort of differentiating between the counting them within the tribe and then counting the collective. Which one exactly is the one that's about focusing on the individual? Is that through the tribe or is that through the full number? That's not totally clear to me. But either way, we have this message of we need to know the number of everybody, but we also want to use that as an opportunity to, notice and lift up their individuality. But we end by saying, if we can do that, because that's the challenge, as we're now going to see as we go on to sort of Rabbi Josh Figelson's little analysis here. That, of course, is the rub. Turning people into numbers can both promote equity between images of the divine, think of Medicare, yet simultaneously erase the uniqueness of those images, again, think of Medicare. Likewise, turning experiences and memories into codified rituals with prescribed times and measures for their performance can likewise drain them of their meaning. Think of bad prayer experiences, or not. Think perhaps of good prayer experiences, meaning the fact that davening is supposed to help draw our attention to the miracles of nature and our history and different qualities of God. but by codifying it into a prescribed liturgy that we say every day, it can make it rote, and we will lose the capacity to, really zero in on those unique meanings, or somehow by focusing on them and their kind of purpose, we can actually elicit them. As Reb Tzadok suggests, the mere fact that something with a unique name and identity has now been accounted as part of a larger corporate identity does not in and of itself drain it of meaning. It just means that perhaps we need to pay more attention. If we can bring our awareness to the unique features of our experience in this moment, this encounter, we can touch the reality that this moment is anything but monotonous. It, like us, is created anew right now. Now I think he's made his leap from the sort of specific example of the census, to being something that's about everything all at once, and also attempting to be about every individual person, to kind of talk about what it's like to walk through life and, go through a certain set of experiences that repeat. It can drain them of meaning, but if we really focus on, okay, I'm doing the same thing I've done every day for a long time, but I'm doing it today, and it has its unique meaning today, then we can connect to it in a different way. But that's really, really hard. This challenge, and I think he's talking about the broader idea, not just of the census, but more broadly, kind of making meaning in a system that has repetition. This challenge is particularly pronounced when we are not dealing with objects or things or rituals, but with people. While the presence of the Creator is latent throughout creation, it is especially so in human beings, images of the divine, meaning when God is part of all of creation and all of nature, but we can potentially experience God the most through our encounter, not just with, trees, but especially with people, because people are created in the image of God. And thus, the attention we bring to our encounters with this person in this moment is of particular importance. Indeed, we might see our mindfulness practice vis-a-vis things and objects. And by the way, we're in Bamidbar, so he's been developing some of these ideas of mindfulness and mindfulness practice already for 3 whole books. Vis-a-vis things and objects, as a kind of practice to prepare us for encounters with other humans and with ourselves, when the divine presence is most visible. Of all our acts of counting, it is the way we count people that matters most. In my earlier life, I was a classical musician, and this challenge is one that many classical musicians encounter. How to make these pieces, which we have heard and played dozens of times before, come alive again in this performance for this audience. Writing of the development of form in Western music, the French philosopher Vladimir Jankelevich offers a response to this challenge very much in the spirit of Reb Tzadok's reflection on Bamidbar. Hearing again, playing again, become modes whereby to discover interminably new relationships or subtle correspondences, beauty kept secret, or hidden intuitions, meaning those are all things you can find through repetition. The polyphonic superimposition of several independent voices that are nonetheless arranged in accord with one another, the multivocal ambiguity that results, the innuendos and allusions that accumulate in these superimposed levels, the unsaid things that they conceal like hidden treasure. In these, no doubt, there is a source of inexhaustible pleasure. Right? So when you listen to an orchestra and you have all the different instruments playing at the same time, you can notice things when you listen to it over and over that you wouldn't have noticed in the beginning. By the way, I do think that this sense of independent voices arranged in accord with another very much resonates, with the way uh, Rabbi Foreman spoke about the Chumash or the Tanakh, and also kind of further layers of Jewish text and tradition, that they are independent voices that are arranged in accord with one another. And when we sort of listen to them talking to each other and come back to them again and again, we can notice different connections between them. In our contemporary culture, the new and novel are so much more valued than the old and traditional. Yet it is from the old, whether rituals or people, that we learn wisdom, and through tradition and the people and communities that convey it, that we live into the life and lives of a larger people. If we are open to it, if we can bring our awareness to it, we find that our names are already written in our people's book. We are a part of this age-old tradition, and we can discover ourselves and our place inside it if we are patiently open to practicing within it. Okay, so we have a few questions for reflection and conversation. We may not discuss them tonight necessarily, but we'll read them and take them with us. So Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen writes, each member of Israel has a share in the Torah, a letter or a section of a letter, and without that letter or section, the Torah scroll, the totality of Israel, is not fit for ritual use. That was a quote from the Pri Tzaddik that we saw above. In your own words, try to paraphrase this statement. What, if anything, about it do you find inviting? What, if anything, do you find challenging? Okay, so what's our reaction to that kind of hypothesis or kind of stated declaration that each of us is a part of a letter or a letter in the Torah scroll, and without any one of us, it's not fit for ritual use. 2, thinking about your relationship with Jewish ritual. When, if ever, have you struggled because you experienced it as routine? When, if ever, have you experienced something positive precisely because of its routine nature? In either case, was there anything about you, rather than people or things beyond your control, that may have contributed to how you experienced the ritual, right? If sometimes, or else, if many times we don't have kavanah in our davening or significant focus or attention to our davening, and then some other times we do, how much recognizing that some of that might be atmospheric, so great davener, people singing along, light streaming into the room, whatever it is. But what are the things that are different about us from one day to another? If I'm thinking about myself, I'm thinking about how well rested I am, whether I rushed into shul or whether I arrived on time or early and was able to settle in, whether I'm looking in the sitter or not, what else is on my mind. Right. So what from which is in our control might have contributed to how we experienced it. If so, what? If not, how might you consider approaching a ritualized moment differently so as to experience it differently? And then finally, and very timely, ideas for practice. Parshat Bamidbar is always read in the waning days of the Omer period. In these final days of the Omer, we're in the last week now, consider engaging in a practice to bring greater awareness and presence to the act of counting each day. You might try this practice, which comes by way of my colleague Rabbi Sam Feinsmith. Begin by sitting with the breath, but with less focus on maintaining concentration and more attention to what makes each breath precious and unique, an event that never happened before and will never happen again. Try to enact an intention of recognizing the way the breath connects you with the whole of existence, the entire field of energy and vitality that surrounds us. Now, count your breaths, but don't count them sequentially, not 1, 2, 3. Instead, count each breath as echad, 1, echad, echad, echad. Do this for 3 to 4 minutes. Then, when you are ready, bring your attention to counting this unique day of the Omer, this day which never was before and never will be again, and which is yet part of a continuum of days connecting the liberation from slavery in Egypt with the acceptance of divine sovereignty at Sinai. I'm going to pause here and let you digest for a moment while I attend to something. Okay. So happy to open up for any thoughts, questions, or reactions, whether the teaching about Bamidbar and counting speaks to you, or whether from any of the questions that he posed, the relationship between repetition and connection um, speaks to you. Really happy to take a few minutes of thoughts and comments. Was that I see Joan and Moshe? I see Lance start there. Go
All
ahead,
right.
Moshe.
Just curious, in Yoshua and in the other books, there was no ever taken a census.
Good question. I think there are other censuses in the Tanakh. Why do you ask?
I don't know, because to me would have made some sense, when Yoshua conquered the land, find out how many, even though it took 14 years, 7 years of disposing of the other inhabitants and 7 years of dividing it.
Hmm.
To me, it would have made more sense to find out, what's the population of the nation or in other
Right,
parts.
right.
You
Yeah,
know,
it's a great question. I'm pretty sure that David HaMelech takes a census. I don't know how whether it was done more commonly and just wasn't reported about in the Tanakh. Um, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, certainly a broader sort of question of when do we count, um, beyond the question of what's the meaning of the counting or how do we relate to the counting. But just to,
Did they do
Rashi
a
in the
census?
what's that?
Did they do a census when they had the base of Migdish? The first or second one?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the idea of the half shekel that was given, I think annually was a census. So it does seem like in temple times there was an annual census that went along, or was achieved by the contribution of the half shekel. So that's again, that seems the Mishnah seems to assume that that was taking place, if I recall correctly. Um, yeah, as I think what Rabbi Fagelston is pushing us to do here is to sort of ask the question, you know, it serves a pragmatic function. It plays a practical role, but what in the way that the Torah presents it, or what in how we think about an action like that can, make us think about what's the meaning of counting, and how do we relate to, groups and the individuals therein. I think that's kind of where the direction he's pushing us. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Lance?
Um, where do we find in the census mistakes and cheating?
Mhm.
You mean to tell me there were no mistakes, there was no cheating?
I can't think of a place where it was found and documented.
Certainly Nadav and Abihu make mistakes, right?
Yes.
And they're punished for it.
Yes.
But apparently there is no record of any mistakes made here.
Right.
And I'm reminded of Mark Twain's comment, lies, more lies, damn lies, statistics.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, uh, I'm trying to remember. I think Rav Meidan points out some discrepancies or questions, but of course attempts to resolve and harmonize them. Um, but I think, yeah, I mean, here too, I guess I would say Rabbi Fagelston would say, I don't know what he would say. I could imagine him saying, like, you know, yes, we want to be mindful of errors, inconsistencies, etc. But if we go to the balcony, so to speak, and ask, what are we meant to take away from the experience of counting and the way the Torah presents it, that's where he wants to drive our thinking. But yeah, I don't know much about, the criticism of the kind of counting and presentation of the counting, right? Certainly the idea that the census at the beginning of the book and the end of the book, 40 years apart, come out to the same 603,550 is surprising. I think we've also, sort of saw in Rav Elchanan Samet, I think he questioned the roundness of the numbers, and could it really be the way it's presented in the Torah? So certainly fair question.
What about the numbers in the Megillah?
Right?
To be a
Yeah.
bit
Yeah. It's
off.
they appear stylized to a degree. Yeah.
And how about age? The numbers of people aging. How do we
Right.
know
Right.
that somebody didn't make a mistake in terms of when the person was born? Maybe they lied about when they were born. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are historical or concrete or real. And what you're talking about here with numbers is abstract thinking.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Bracha, please.
So two things. One is about the subject of repetition and what purpose that serves. It reminds me of times that I've been involved in plays and how no matter what, the repetition was very grounding in terms of knowing your lines, having a sense of what the next person was going to be saying and things like that. And at the same time, there was this magic that it was never the same each night. There was always something, whether it was to do with the cast composition, whether it was to do with the audience reception, whether it was something that happened in the daytime that affected the evening. There were just so many things in the mix, and it always had that combination of the grounding of repetition and the openness to surprise and how to work with that. That took a bunch of individuals that had maybe not known each other before and turned them into community through that process.
Mm-hmm.
If it was only for a short period of time. So that's my experience with it, and how that's so parallel to what he's talking about here. And also thinking about his mentioning of Echad as a meditative mindfulness kind of thing. And thinking of Echad as an individual, and we were talking earlier on about the uniqueness of each individual having a letter in the Torah and something like that. But we also get a hint at the beginning of Echad is Ach, that this is not just a unique individual or a random individual. You have a connection to each of those Echads.
Nice. Beautiful. Yeah, interesting to think about how repetition, what role repetition could play in forming community, kind of having a consistent shared experience. How does that sort of help form bonds as opposed to something less orderly or structured? It's interesting. Oh, you went mute again.
Even the things that don't work form bonds, like when there are mistakes that are made and someone else helps by giving the next line, or there's an accident and how you deal with that, all those things.
Yes. Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. David.
Since Lance was not adequately provocative tonight, I wanted to pick it up in support of him. And what really surprised me, and I almost couldn't get beyond it, was when Rabbi Fagelson talks about the difference between solving social problems and dealing with individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And what he doesn't seem to point, and I believe this is where he picks up the misguided religion of Ruth Messenger. And what he doesn't talk about here is, what is your mitzvah? I don't think that we're commanded, certainly not as individuals, to solve social problems. We are commanded that when we come upon an individual, we have obligation towards them and how we can relate to them. And this utilitarian approach of saying, I understand that if I do something for one person, it doesn't actually change the world. Does he say repair the world? I don't think he used that phrase.
Yeah. Right.
Doesn't solve the social problem. But who says that's your job? And he's just bringing a modern concept into what is our commanded role in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so good. You achieved the goal of being provocative, and I like it. And like, I guess I want to offer a thin response, and then try for I don't know if there's something thicker. Just on the textual analysis, it's interesting because he doesn't say, um, I see I'm able to help someone, but when I help them, I think about the fact that I'm not able to transform the system, and in not transforming the system, I failed on a basic religious duty. He just sort of says, like, my mind goes to the upstream problems, and I'm conscious of the fact that in helping this one person, I'm not necessarily solving those. I mean, he doesn't really even talk in either case about this as fulfillment of a responsibility or an obligation from a Jewish or Torah perspective. He just almost speaks about it more generically. So it's interesting in that sense. He doesn't incorporate sort of mitzvah to that conversation really at all. Um, but I do think it is, I am provoked to sort of think about that question, um, of what is our responsibility to solve systemic problems or to try. Um,
Well, if I can add to the provocation a little bit,
yeah,
the danger of tending towards saying that our main purpose is to solve systemic problems eliminates our ability to see ourselves as being in common purpose with the more traditional parts of our community who have dedicated themselves to what we would call chesed,
yes.
and who do things like visiting the sick and burying the dead and preparing
Mhm.
for Shabbat and rejoicing with the bride and the groom. These things don't solve problems. And our Torah tells us actually many of these problems aren't going to go away.
Yes.
And even if we dedicate ourselves, for whatever reasons, religious or others, to try to address the systemic problems, the importance of actually having respect for our brethren who are engaged in these acts of chesed, number one, and the importance of understanding the value of engaging with an individual as opposed to engaging with an abstract concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I won't say anything about painting murals in neighborhoods as a way to feel like you're doing chesed without ever meeting the people you're doing it with or for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very
Yeah.
different than frankly, very different from the Habitat for Humanity model.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I see how you got, bogged down in that beginning piece. Um, yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't even feel in the end like,
So it was unnecessary.
yeah, that he even totally circles back to it. Um, he focuses on the relationship between the individual and the general, but not so much on the topic of fixing problems. Um, so yeah, it was an intro that sort of draws you in, and it's a names a challenge that is relatable, but then this really doesn't come back to it quite. So I think it's I'm glad you raised it, and it's something to take with us, think about in the broader question, of course, of yes, how do we balance responsibilities, obligations to individuals with systems, and what is the level, what's the Torah's focus, and subsequent generations of interpretation, I think is a great question. All right, Lance and Debbie, before we wrap up.
Okay, well, if you have a professor of English and the professor's trying to teach someone how to write, then the professor has grammar book and all the traditional grammar that he's trying to, or she is trying to project onto the student. I've done that many times. And however, if you're a linguistics professor, you see language as something that's constantly changing and changing, not because somebody is there trying to change it, but it's because people are conversing, and out of that conversation, the language changes. The question is, when did Latin become French? And the answer is, it's impossible to tell. You know, at this point, how many people in France are speaking Latin? But the point is that every day, for example, if I come to an intersection and I have the right of way, but I stop and I let someone go through, that could change the world, right?
Yeah.
That few seconds difference could be the difference between an accident, a death, or living. And we
Right.
have absolutely, in my perspective, hopefully not being too provocative, I have no control over that.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Great. Hold on. My window disappeared for a moment. There we go. I think Debbie is our last for tonight. Go ahead.
I enjoyed all the comments. A thought that I had was that considering today was Yom Yerushalayim, one of the thoughts that bounced off from what we were reading when it was talking about, you know, the next generation had to think of how to remember. So it's 77 years. I think one of the problems, or one of the challenges, let's put it that way, that Israel is grappling with is it's the next generation, and how do you deal with Zionism today, and how do you deal with the 6-Day War? Many of the people never lived through, and how do you keep the history alive, and specifically because they have so much new history that keeps happening. But you have, it's so meaningful what has happened in the past, and their history is so vibrant. It's not like, you know, the American Revolution was then, and then you had, you know, 50, 60 years when nothing happened. And then you had, let's say, the War of 1812, and then you had the Civil War. We have maybe 10 years from every cataclysmic thing that happens, and then it gets less and less. And each thing is in and of itself so amazing. And how do we digest this and internalize it and make it meaningful and pass it on to the next generation?
Yeah.
I think that was one of the thoughts that pinged off in my mind when I read that paragraph.
Yeah. So true. Our history is fast-paced right now, and there's a lot to process, exactly like you said, process, internalize, transmit. That does feel like a challenge of today for sure. Okay, so we're off and running, and again, feel free to read the introduction. I'll try to send it again next week, and of course, try to check my calendar for a moment. I think we should be next Monday is Shavuot, so we will not be meeting, but we will send a Naso essay, and then we should be back the following Monday, the 9th. So looking forward to good Yom Tov to all. And
9 o'clock, will it be 9 o'clock?
9 o'clock. Yep. Love to mom and dad.
Chag Sameach, Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov. Bye.